and I'm happy to welcome you here to the day 6 of this remarkable conference, addressing the topic, Confronting Hate, Humanity's Greatest Challenge. Have you been having a good time this week? Has it stretched your mind a lot? I think it's been a wonderful, wonderful time. It's hard to have it over. On the other hand, we have to get back to life as normal. And we do face a small challenge this morning. Our scheduled speaker, Jim Carnes, of the Southern Poverty Law Center, he's been unable to make it here from Alabama, and I'm very sorry. But he has sent his speech, and Josh Buhner has agreed to convey it to you. So I'll introduce both Jim Carnes, who isn't here, and his stand-in, Josh Buhner, who is. So Jim Carnes is director of the Teaching Tolerance Project of the Southern Poverty Law Center, located in Montgomery, Alabama. And he's also editor of their Teaching Tolerance magazine. I have a couple of copies of that if there are any of you afterwards who are interested in looking at some of the Teaching Tolerance material. Jim Carnes wrote a book. It's titled Us and Them, A History of Intolerance in America. And this book has received a number of laudatory citations. He co-authored another publication, Starting Small, Teaching Tolerance in Preschool and Early Grades. And I think that's available also through the Teaching Tolerance publications. And he edited Responding to Hate at School. So Teaching Tolerance is the educational project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And you may be familiar with the Southern Poverty Law Center. It has 3 arms. It has one which is the lawyers like Morris Deese, who came here and helped us with the trial that prosecuted, or the civil trial against the Aryan nations. Then also the intelligence report. Mark Potok, the editor of that, was here, and some of you may have heard him this week. And then the other wing is this Teaching Tolerance, their educational arm, in which they recognize the importance of education, and they publish a number of things, including this magazine, and they make their materials available to teachers free or at a very small cost, teachers in public schools, private schools, churches. So it's a wonderful service that they are doing. The mission of Teaching Tolerance is, and I quote, to make sure that every classroom in America is equipped with tools to help young people learn to live together in harmony. Well, I was one of 3 members of our Human Rights Education Foundation board that journeyed to Alabama 3 years ago to visit the Southern Poverty Law Center. And we did spend some time with Morris Deese and a little bit of time on the intelligence report. But Jim Carnes very graciously spent, I'm sure he gave us an hour and a half of his time, and then loaded us up with a box load of materials to bring back. It's very clear that Jim Carnes and the Southern Poverty Law Center take very seriously their mission to try to assist teachers and schools throughout the country. So I have not read his speech, so I'm looking forward to hearing what Josh is going to read to us. So let me introduce Josh Buhner, and many of you may already know Josh because he's a recent graduate of North Idaho College. And while he was here, he was president of the Human Equality Club. Josh is in the process of graduating from Eastern Washington State University, and he doesn't have much further to go. He's a former member of the boards of both my organization, Human Rights Education Foundation, and the mouthful, Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations. And he now works for Safeco in Seattle, and we miss him a lot. But in Seattle, at Safeco, he was chosen to serve on a 17-member employee committee. It's called the Diversity Committee at Safeco. And Josh was, which is quite an honor. This is the nationwide, Safeco has a diversity committee, and they are committed to really integrating diversity throughout the company. So to be on this 17-member employee committee is quite an honor. And Josh is responsible for bringing the president, CEO, and chairman of the board, Mike McGavick, to Coeur d'Alene yesterday, and he was the featured speaker at the annual Human Rights Banquet. So we're pretty grateful to Josh. He now lives in Seattle with his wife, Jamie, and their 19-month-old daughter, Kylie. So will you please welcome our friend, Josh Buhner.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Thanks. Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? I want to make sure my mic works well, and I'm having a problem with my throat a little bit. So is it okay back there? Okay. And when Mary Lou talks about working for Safeco, it's not Safeco Field, as many people think. I work for the baseball field over in Seattle, but Safeco Insurance Company. I was at a doctor's office one time, and she says, "So do you know many of the players?" I wasn't quite sure what she meant, and I don't think she realized that Safeco is an insurance company that actually pays a lot of money to have their name on the side of the Seattle Mariners field. Well, good morning, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, Mary Lou. There are two people that I would consider a mentor that I've had for many years. One of those is Mary Lou Reed, and the other one's a professor here at the college. As Mary Lou indicated, I am not Jim Carnes, but I'm going to do my best in trying to share with you the words that Jim felt necessary and important to share with North Idaho College today. We've always talked a good game in America, from our childhood recitations of the Pledge of Allegiance, the Star-Spangled Banner, our social study lessons on the founding documents and the Statue of Liberty, and our scrutiny of coins. We acquire the soothing catchphrases of democracy, liberty and justice for all, created equal, we the people, a more perfect union, land of the free, give me your tired, your poor, out of many, one. It's no secret that our nation's founding fathers didn't practice what they preached. According to some critics, these privileged white males, many of them slaveholders, brazenly exempted themselves and their peers from the demands they placed on prosperity. Such alleged hypocrisies have prompted campaigns to remove long revered names from city streets, schools, and other facilities. Another view is that the free, just, and pluralistic society they declared amounted to a prophetic vision, a radical insight into universal truths that they could not transcribe, that they could transcribe but not fully enact. Whatever explanation, their words pose an enormous challenge to anyone who would dare to be a teacher. How long does it take for the disharmony to register for a child's experience, to reveal the tension between these beautiful images and the society they claim to signify? For some, it comes early, in the piercing blow of a homophobic slur on the playground, in a teacher's insistent mispronunciation of one's name, in the anger of a parent stung by racism, in the thundering report of opportunity or even entry denied. For some, the dissonance sounds a warning. Pledge your allegiance lightly, if at all. For others, it gives a voice to the blues, an anguished resolve to endure the paradox and perhaps eventually to outwit it or at least outlast it. For another group, and here I count myself, the awakening is slow, insidious, and unsettling. It exposes privileges and exemptions that we would prefer to conceal. For others, the disharmony itself is reassuring. A reminder that one is, as the saying goes, more equal than others. In spite of such recent overlays as more equitable laws, mass media, mass marketing, and the rhetoric of colorblindness, our individual experiences, what it's like to be an American, are still upon deep reflection, disparate enough to blow us apart. The civil rights movement, for those of us who remember or have studied it, seemed for a brief span to offer some hope of making good on those catchphrases. Of course, there have been and will always be extremists who cannot abide by the real implications of our national rhetoric. But at least for a time, even in the face of the most staggering setbacks, our public institutions seem poised to rise above confoundments of race and ethnicity. For a time, it seemed that public life in general, and public education in particular, might one day be colorblind. Then along comes multiculturalism, the educational offspring of the movement to muddy the waters. Colorblindness, says multiculturalists, is not only unattainable, it's inequitable in its own right. In her book, Affirming Democracy, the Social Political Context of Multicultural Education, Sonia Nieto has written, "I don't see black or white," a teacher will say. "I see only students." This statement assumes that to be colorblind is to be fair, impartial, and objective. It sounds fair and honest and ethical, but the opposite may actually be true. That is, to see differences in the line of reasoning is to see the defects and inferiority. Thus, to be colorblind may result in the refusing to accept differences and therefore accepting the dominant culture as the norm. It may result in denying the very identity of our students, thereby making them invisible. What seems on the surface is impeccably fair, in reality may be fundamentally unfair. In tracing the roots of discrimination, the late Harvard social psychologist Gordon Allport began with a rather embarrassing survival trait. In his 1954 classic, The Nature of Prejudice, he devotes a great deal of attention to our inherent egocentricity. I recommend this book with one caveat. Though Allport's research and analysis remain sound and fresh as the day the book was published, his rhetoric framework, particularly his assumption of white middle-class perspective in the third-person plural, is dated. I would urge you not to take offense at this evidence of the book's age. Quote, "Nature requires that every individual be self-sufficient biological organisms. He must devote his life cycle to maintaining his physical and mental integrity. Thus, in a sense, everything he does has to be self-centered. The adherence of this imperative requires us to cultivate a strong, as Allport calls it, clamorous, and that's with a C, sense of self. The ego, he says, is the pivot of our existence. Any slights to our integrity or challenges, our self-determination, as we all know, can arouse an arsenal of defenses that range from resentment to rage. At Teaching Tolerance, we occasionally provoke the defensive reflex with the very name of our project. I don't want to be tolerated, someone will say. I want to be appreciated. As if tolerance had a slightly sour flavor. About once a month, someone writes to us with a suggestion that we change the name of our magazine to Teaching Acceptance or Teaching Appreciation. Admittedly, no single word quite expresses what we are after. The catchiness of alliteration offers a certain marketing appeal, but what I really enjoy sharing with these people is a footnote to the word tolerance. Somewhere deep in the origins lays the Latin verb tollere, meaning to lift up. So, one small part of my mission is to reclaim the notability, the sense of empathy and elevation implicit in that word. This pivotal self then doesn't want to be merely put up with, but appreciated, respected, and loved for its uniqueness. Yet we are blessed at birth with a somewhat opposite need for sameness, for membership and affirmation from a group of people recognized like ourselves. Again, I want to turn to Gordon Allport, who explores at length the need for group identity and its consequences. Most of business life, he says, can go with less effort. If we stick together with our own kind, it will not always be the dominant majority that forces minority groups to remain silent. They often prefer to keep their identity, so they need not strain to speak a foreign language or watch their manners. The initial fact, therefore, is that human groups tend to stay apart. We need not ascribe this tendency to a gregarious instinct, to a consciousness of kind or prejudice. The fact is explained by these principles of ease, less effort, congeniality, and pride in one's own culture. But Allport is quick to caution. Once this separatism exists, he writes, the ground is laid for all sort of psychological elaboration. People who stay separate have few channels of communication. They easily exaggerate the degree of differences between groups and readily misunderstand the grounds for it. And perhaps most important of all, separateness may lead to genuine conflicts of interest as well as imaginary conflicts. At the micro level, of course, this craving for sameness results in a kind of voluntary segregation that I'm sure we've all experienced. In her book, memorably titled, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria?, Beverly Daniel Tatum notes a further complication to the phenomenon that Allport describes. Quote, people of color learn early in life that they are seen by others as members of a group. For whites, thinking of oneself as an individual is very compatible with the dominant ideology of rugged individualism and the American myth of meritocracy. What does it say about white people if black people are sitting together? The white person wonders, am I being excluded? Are they talking about us? Are my own racial stereotypes and perhaps fears being stimulated? As Carlos Cortez and others have pointed out, the growing number of multicultural and multi-ethnic individuals are going to be instrumental in helping the rest of us break the old patterns. At the macro level, the human tendency towards separatism often manifests as nationalism. We see the patterns being played out today in many parts of the globe. In fact, in many countries for much of history, the term nationalism can be read as ethnic nationalism. A country of people who look or talk or behave pretty much as I do. Independent movements in the far-flung regions rivet our attention in part because we recognize in all humanity our own twin needs for individuality and sameness, for self-determination and separatism. When a scrappy, belligerent independence movement halfway around the globe stirs something in our American bellies, what exactly is being stirred? Our innate aversion to oppression? Surely, but what manner of nationalhood are we most sincerely endorsing? There are citizens from our own country, and my organization spends a great deal of time studying some of them, who envision a United States premised on the ethnic nationalism, a United States of white people. Their rhetoric ranges from subtle to searing, from academic treatises on biological determination to the vilification of the mud races. We may bristle or scoff at the prospect, and yet here, the core of our cognitive dissonance makes us squirm. We, the people, left a lot of people out. A staggering contradiction. Glorious ideal on the one hand, and on the other, a miserable failure to make the real. Gordon Allport reminds us that diversity is taxing. Pluralism, to which our nation has perhaps adversely dedicated itself, is more than demographic fact or political axiom. It's a work in progress with the emphasis on the word work. It requires us more than putting up with differences, more than sitting in one big cafeteria, but at different tables. Back when a steady flow of European immigration fueled our industrial expansion, the catchy industrial image of the melting pot served as a compelling metaphor for our cultural assimilation. Like the Rust Belt of the Midwest, the melting pot metaphor has outlived its usefulness. Quilts, mosaics, and salad bowls seemed more apt today. But was there ever a melting pot in the first place? Did Jim Crow get assimilated out of existence? Over the course of 2 centuries, our collective experience has broadened our understanding of the proposition that all men are created equal. Today, our laws and public institutions more justly, if not yet, fully recognize the equality of all people. In a sense, our history can be read as a struggle to embrace full measures of who we, the people, are. Time and again, once excluded, Americans, once excluded from the circle, have claimed their birthright in the old ideals. In so doing, they make us all fuller beneficiaries of our nation's creed. They have kept us moving, slowly but surely, toward a more perfect union. We've come a long journey, but the end is not in sight. Each generation must ask the next to do a better job of doing it, to bring us closer to what Josiah Royce called the beloved community. The last decade offered encouraging signs. Breaking events of the late 20th century linked political liberation and cultural expression around the world. Despite a sharp setback in China, the peaceful overthrow of Eastern European communism and South African apartheid raised hopes that the world's remaining engines of oppression and degradation, and with them, maybe even the very idea of war, were operating on borrowed time. As if on cue, the internet arrived to our contest, our assumptions about cultural vitality and borders even further. A new global transparency makes it possible for indigenous people worldwide to share strategies for language preservation, or for American middle schoolers to speak out on behalf of child laborers in Pakistan. To some, it began to be clear that our founding principles of nationality had been pointing to global citizenship all along. Now, in the span of a morning wind, a different litany rules the day. United we stand, God bless America, never forget, Homeland Security. For those who value the discourse, the enormous welcome that democracy ventures, the question is obvious. What vision of community do these new refrains afford? Our job as educators for pluralism may temporarily become a bit harder, but we have powerful tools at our disposal, and the most powerful is the oldest of them all. By ourselves or within groups, we can glimpse only a sliver of what it means to be human. Only by placing our stories alongside the stories of others across a broad spectrum of experiences as possible can bring ourselves whole. In the interest in following my own advice, I'll share with you a story of my own. I grew up in a small town in northeast Mississippi where my father's family had settled in the 1820s. The Methodist church my family attended occupied an imposing antebellum edifice with a balcony around 3 walls of its sanctuary. We children learned early that the balcony had been built as a place for slaves to sit or that to worship, in clear view while their owners sat and worshipped on the main floor. As I winch in retrospect, I think of the level of discourse around the mind-blowing image, simply a quaint historical footnote imparted to generations of young Sunday schoolers without elaboration or interpretation. Any cognitive dissonance that may have arisen was easily drowned out by the pipe organ. Like most of you of a certain age, I can remember exactly where I was on the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963. That day was an earlier generation's 9/11. I sat in the 3rd grade classroom in Mississippi waiting for my mother to get me out of school early for my first eye doctor's appointment. Just before she was to pick me up, the principal announced the news over the PA system. I remember that several boys in my classroom cheered, but perhaps thankfully, no matter how hard I try, I can't remember whether I was amongst them or not. I proceeded to my mother's car and noted her solemn expression. When I climbed into the back seat, she said, "This will be in the history books one day." At the doctor's office, the television set in the waiting room up front was turned to CBS News. Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather narrated the unfolding national tragedy. In the other waiting room, marked colored, an enclosed side porch, a radio broadcast the same urgent story. Out front, the white people sat composed, watchful. From the back, we could hear crying, moaning, praying, and singing over the buzz of the radio voices. The nurse came in to dilate my eyes. As the world was going blurry, I saw the nurse conferring with a doctor in the hall. After a few minutes, the nurse and an assistant began bringing extra chairs into the waiting room. Then she went back and invited the colored people, the people in the colored waiting room, to come watch the television. The white people remained perfectly still. The colored people had church. I couldn't see much because of my eye drops, but the dissonance that afternoon stayed in my ears. Again, a historical footnote, this time experienced firsthand, again, no interpretation. The empirical data alone might have led my child self to simply conclude, when the president dies, everybody gets to watch TV. A more sophisticated analysis would suggest that under certain extraordinary circumstances, the walls between two worlds were permeable. It goes without saying that the next time I visited the doctor's office, the two waiting rooms were back to what they would consider normal. In reflection, I wonder what led the doctor and the nurse to defy Jim Crow, if only for a few hours. Was it Christian charity? Common decency? Fear at the sight of unfiltered emotion? I'll never know. What matters is that for a brief span, the status quo was broken open. The wall tumbled, and the discord between schoolbook rhetoric and everyday reality charged the air. I don't purport this recollection to be unique in any significant respect. Anyone who was older than the age of 4 that afternoon can recount some detail of their experiences of it. Rather, I offer it as an example of a keen, necessary irritant to the conscience, a moment of cognitive dissonance that simply goes with the territory of being an American. I submit to you that only by acknowledging and reflecting upon our personal experience of this dissonance, we might even call it vertigo, can we find our balance, orient ourselves in the still uncharted territory between American reality and the American dream. My job keeps me in constant contact with progressive, innovative teachers nationwide. Much of the most exciting work I see in education today across grade levels and across curriculum and across the country is explicitly aimed at building communities. Kindergartners practice respect and trust in sharing circles. Cooperative learning gives elementary students a common sense of purpose. Middle schoolers use peer mediation to keep the peace. And community service is an increasingly popular component of the high school curriculum. The project I direct was founded to search out and celebrate efforts that promote unity and diversity. In advocating for tolerance, however, or its counterparts, fairness, cooperation, or equity, it's important to remember that such outward-reaching, community-building practices are premised upon the inherent dignity and integrity of each individual. Among secular initiatives, the charter education movement has made great strides in highlighting these essential values. The challenge is to avoid shrink-wrapping them as self-esteem. Recognizing one's own unique worth is not a solipsistic end in itself, but rather a common ground in which all perspective affiliations are rooted. Thus, the best education for the common good entails both the big picture of community, interdependence, and a close-up recognition of what communities are made of. As we seek to help our children do a better job than we've done at building strong, resilient, diverse communities, we must start with the conviction that the words of master teacher Vivian Guzman Paisley, every child is equally worthwhile individual. Every person has a story. For a teacher, as for parents, The further responsibility is to particularize our respect, valuing each student not merely in principle as a person, but in practice as that person. Here are the seeds of a just and caring society. Children so treated can scarcely help but do the same. As I see it, my job and that of my colleagues is to help teachers and students envision what can happen if we tolerate each other in the best sense of the world. If we lift each other up, I invite you through your work as educators and whatever opportunity that may entail to help them imagine what our diverse communities might be like if we talk to each other as if our lives depended on it. Thank you.
First of all, we want to thank Josh Buhner. He was so kind to do this, and Jim Carnes sends his regrets. He was just really, really sorry that this happened, that he could not be here. And when he called, he immediately emailed his speech to me, and Josh was so gracious to do it. He also was scheduled to do a workshop tomorrow from 9 to 12, and some educators are taking this for credit. The good news is that the workshop will go on. We've been able to restructure, and we have a very outstanding person from the law school at the University of Calgary in Alberta to present, along with the executive director of the Gonzaga University Institute for Action Against Hate, Jerry Shepard, and two other colleagues. The four of them will present the 3-hour workshop along with two brief parts of films that they will show. You're very much invited to that from 9 to noon in the Student Union tomorrow. You've been so wonderful and gracious this week, and to attend, we really stretched the envelope and had 44 programs for you, and you keep coming. I do want to invite you for the afternoon at 1 o'clock. We have a very special guest from New York City. Ken Stern, who's with the American Jewish Committee, will address this audience in this auditorium, and I've known Ken for quite a long time, and he will be a very fine speaker on the topic of the need for an academic discipline of hate studies. Some things he will say may surprise some educators in how he thinks that should be approached. So, particularly for you who are future teachers or educators now, I think you will find his comments very provoking and informative and helpful. Then this afternoon at 2:30 we will have a panel. It's a rather long panel, but it's a very, very fine group, and they're going to discuss how can education serve as an antidote to hate. And then this afternoon we will also have here other programs. We will have workshops at both of them at 4:30, and our guests are from the University of Idaho who are very informed, as well as there will be 2 panels at Gonzaga University. And tomorrow at noon we will close out the 33rd year of the Popcorn Forum. It's been exhilarating and informative, and as I have said on a number of occasions, if you look at your program, some years ago we really focused on what our mission would be as long as we were having this series, and that is that for you who are so good to come, we are very convinced that when the week ends that you are a better thinker and doer. You're more empowered. You are more wise. You're more knowledgeable. And you also understand the complexities of life. I would like to also say that I am very, very pleased with the articulation of our programs this week, our keynote speakers, our panelists, our workshop people. They are all experts, and what impressed me most about them from around the United States, every one of them came with great dedication, and no one took an honorarium, and therefore it made it possible for us to have a lot larger program. That's because of their commitment to human rights. Obviously, Josh is not going to attempt to field questions on behalf of Mr. Carnes. That would be unfair, but Josh is a great, great friend, and he has a real passion for human rights. And one story about him as I close is that when he was here working, he became a victim of hate because of his stand for human rights. And when that happened, they did a story, and in that story they called him a human rights activist or a civil rights activist, and he came to me and said, what a great honor. I am now part of the Activists for Human Rights, and he's continued his work in Seattle. He stays in close contact, and when the CEO of Safeco appointed him as one of the 17 members nationwide of the Diverse Committee, he wouldn't say this, but I will. He and one other member of that committee were the major architects of the program and presented it to their board of directors. And it is a remarkable program that includes training of all the thousands of their employees. It involves interns at their company, and it also involves minority scholarships around America. I believe Safeco will become the #1 insurance company in America as a model for diversity. When this CEO took over 2 years ago, they were not ranked at all in this arena, and now one of the top organizations in the country has ranked Safeco out of the 50 top corporations #16 in diversity, and the man sitting behind me had a lot to do with that. I knew Josh was going to do a lot, but I didn't know it was going to be so quick at age 24. He is a product of our community, and he will continue to stay in close touch. And again, thank you for coming, and I hope you'll be here at 1.